Well, guys, let's get into the big news, right? So Masvidal versus Usman, part two. How did we get here? Back up the timeline for you. Short notice fight. Masvidal last year agrees to fly out to Fight Island on 8 days' notice, make weight, take on Usman, 25-minute fight. They go out, they do that. Masvidal leaves with all the credit. I mean, that was one thing about that fight. Masvidal won 0 rounds. Said, look, it was short notice. I didn't have a training camp. He, quite frankly, it was a very valiant effort. If you go look at the fact that he got skunked and didn't win a round, but you don't go watch the fight itself, you're going to have a very misled interpretation of what happened. It was a good competitive match. Very competitive match. But when the whole thing was done, Masvidal's stock goes up and Usman stays steady. I kind of look at it and go, but wait a minute. Usman did the same thing Masvidal did. Masvidal's getting credit for taking on Usman on 8 days' notice. Usman took on Masvidal on 8 days' notice. I mean, right, it was just one of these things. But I'm taking you back to that time, once upon a time, because that match, and if you watched it, or moreover, if you didn't watch it and you go read the result, does not warrant a rematch. But it was different, because Masvidal didn't make one excuse. He didn't say anything other than, I've now learned what I needed to learn, and if I have a full training camp, I'll beat this guy. And it was one of those things where it was very hard to say, no, you wouldn't. I understand a lot of things in fighting are that way, but there's some stories that resonate and they stick. And Masvidal was valiant in this. And the fight also did not go the way that you might think. Did not go the way that we all predicted it would ahead of time, which, well, if it stays on his feet, Masvidal, and if it goes to the ground, Usman. It was not one of those old school throwbacks to 1993. There was 2 mixed martial artists that both did a little bit of everything. And by the way, Masvidal's wrestling deficit was not as great as your mind may falsely remind you it was. Masvidal wrestled with him. And while Kamar out-wrestled Masvidal, Masvidal wrestled with him. And Masvidal did a great job of getting up off the ground. He made the takedowns hard to get. Made Usman second-guess himself. Do I want to go through this energy? When Usman did get them, Masvidal scrambled back up to his feet. A large part of where this fight was lost for Masvidal was up against the fence. Usman did a really good job getting underhooks, push him into the fence, eat up a little bit of time, frustrate him. There's no crowds at these things. That's relevant. It's very relevant because the crowd would have been booing and booing against the fence. It may have made the referee step in and break the action a couple of times. It's very relevant. The fact that there was no crowd, Usman spent a lot of time up against the fence, but that was also a weak spot for Masvidal. It's somewhere that every opponent that's faced Usman after the fact can look back and see one thing they have in common, which is we got pushed into the fence and this monster held us there and beat away at our thighs, at our ribs. It's one of these spots that if you're taking on Usman, you better be well aware of, but it's also one of the spots that makes me wonder when Masvidal came out and said, I learned what I needed to learn. I know if I have a training camp, what I need to go work on. I will assure you that's one of the spots. And the thought of these two fighting again with the full training camps, that's a good story for me. I don't know how out of shape Masvidal was. Only Masvidal knows. We know that Usman was not. We know that Usman wasn't preparing for Masvidal. We know that Usman did not have the strategy in the training camp in mind for that opponent. But we do know that Usman had a full training camp. That he was at least ready and prepared to go in a main event spot for 25 minutes. Those are major advantages. Those are major advantages that Masvidal didn't have. And Masvidal has never been very clear. He has never been any clearer than what I just spoke to you. I am absolutely using verbatim when I say to you that Masvidal said, I learned what I needed to learn. Give me a full training camp and I can beat this guy. End quote. But that's very relevant because I would be curious as a fan, what was it that you learned specifically? And moreover, what kind of shape was Masvidal in? We only have a couple of clues there. One, that Masvidal works relatively hard all the time anyway. And 2, that Masvidal could make weight on that short of notice while in the middle of a pandemic and flying across the country. The mere fact that he could make weight speaks at least a little bit to the level of condition and preparedness. It would be general preparedness but that Masvidal had, because look, if Masvidal was telling the truth and he was to come out and say, yeah, that was me at my worst. I was exhausted 12 minutes in. I hung in there for the next 13 because I'm a competitor and I'm a fighter. I would be very interested in hearing that. I don't suggest for you that that's going to sway the pay-per-view or that's even going to grab the average fan, but you guys would think it's interesting, right? So would I. Us hardcore fans, that would be very, very interesting if Masvidal accurately told us where he was. Do it on a scale of 1 to 10. Masvidal, how prepared were you for that fight? Scale of 1 to 10. If he was around a 7, what if he came back and said he was only at a 6? I mean, right, we're taking with a grain of salt that he tells us the truth, that we actually get accurate information on this, but wouldn't that be very interesting? And as I tell you, he never won a round. One of the 3 judges did give Masvidal 1 round. But the other rounds and the other judges, and all of us that viewed it, would at least have to tip our hat to Masvidal and admit it was a competitive fight. It wasn't questionable. We were not, after the last bell and prior to Bruce Buffer, we were not left wondering who won the fight, but we would have to admit it was a fight. They were out there fighting. There was never a point, including in the 5th round, where Kamaru Usman took his foot off the gas because he's got this one locked up. Masvidal was coming at him, and Masvidal was annoying him at times, particularly with the kicks. If you guys haven't seen this fight and you want to go back and watch the fight, know the story of the fight, go watch the first 30 seconds of the fight. Masvidal walks out, he kicks him right in the belly. Walks across the ring, kicks him right in the ribs, gets his attention, decides he likes it, does the same kick, kicks him again. Exact same kick, exact same way. All of a sudden, Usman realized, well, we're not doing a feeling out period here. It was a fun match. I mean, I'm giving you the X's and O's, but the X's and O's of this match are going to change. They are going to be compelling. I want a better answer, and I want people that talk with Masvidal to get a little bit more specifics on it. Hey, when you said you learned something, what? What was it that you learned? If he's open with you, he's going to probably mention 2 or 3 things. One of them are going to be being held to the fence. Okay, guys, as this comes down, though, you know what? I digress because I'm actually going at a different topic here. This is just the breaking news of the day. But as I digress and we break this down, we now have some clarity on the board. 2 of the players, 2 of the pieces are now gone. So of the pieces that remain, you can't overlook Gilbert Burns. Period. Not that any of you are, but you can't. Nobody can deny Colby Covington. He's one of the top stars in the sport. John Anik said, and I quote, that Colby Covington not only is one of the great welterweights of all time, he's one of the best pound-for-pound fighters of all time. That is from John Anik, who sits ringside and has watched countless fights. And there's a big compliment there. You cannot deny Colby Covington. But what do? Put those guys together? Well, hold that thought, because now Leon is apparently back in the mix. And while Leon might not have won his last fight, Leon hadn't lost a fight in 5 years. He has not lost a fight. And now he's back, and he's on the forefront of people's mind, and he's in main event and championship talks. I mean, that talk 5 days ago had to do with Leon and world championships. So I bring that to you because he is in the mix. What are you going to do with Mike Chiesa? Mike Chiesa is now a main event fighter who, by the way, got the edge on Neil Magny, who is also a main event fighter. I mean, 170 is really interesting right now. It appears very clear that Chiesa is willing. It appears very clear that Burns is willing. We got to take Leon's temperature. We got to find out where he's at. And as happy as everybody is with Leon right now and Leon's attitude in the last 2 weeks, we did not live with that same attitude as recently as 2 months ago or 10 months ago. It was hard to get Leon out of the dugout. I'm not passing judgment on Leon. I'm passing, if we're going to look at the players and the pieces and we're going to start to see who we have left. I mean, just out of willingness, just out of, yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it too. Do we got to put Chiesa and Burns together just on willing, just because we can get a yes? Because we have other things to do just to get one done. Do we put them together? Maybe. Maybe. It's not a bad matchup, but it would still leave you with, what is Colby going to do? One of the biggest stars in the sport, one of the top draws. What's he going to do? Did Leon do enough in terms of reinserting himself? I'm talking about from a popularity standpoint. You can come to the table with a lot of things. If you want to match with Colby Covington, you're going to have to also bring that. Like it or not, that's going to be a prerequisite by Chaos that you have a level of popularity. Did Leon do enough? Maybe. But I mean, see, these are some of the questions, and we're getting very slow answers. But we are getting answers. We are getting resolution. Even if it's slow, we are getting resolution. And the only reason we're not mentioning Chimaev in this mix is out of respect to Chimaev. We have heard that he is dealing with ailments. So you don't want to give a guy, you want to give a guy encouragement. You want him to know that you remember him and think of him, but you do not want to give him any kind of a pressure. You don't want him to think that his spot is going to be taken away or that his spot must be defended. You just want him to get better, right? So it's one of those things where you delicately, but you also have to remember, even if doing it with white gloves, you got to remember Chimaev. You're then going to have the return of T-Wood. Robbie Lawler is going to reinsert himself. I mean, right? 170 is interesting. And 170 is starting to get a little bit of clarity. But as I see it, there's a major opportunity for somebody at 170 right now, today. Whether you find yourself an opponent and you get yourself on that card, I'm talking about 261. I'm talking about the card that's going to be headlined by the welterweight title fight of Usman versus Masvidal. You get yourself a partner, you get yourself nice and beautifully aligned on this card. So if something happens to the main event, you slide up, or you make the phone call, you go into training camp, you get an agreement, and you just go right in as the backup fighter. I think the backup fighter is a real thing myself. I think the backup fighter is cloaked in marketing opportunities myself. I think it's got to be used right. I think it's being misused. But I also think if you're a 170-pounder, you want an opportunity, and you need a certain motivation to get yourself training, which probably is probably accurate for most guys, right? That's a perfect way to do it. Perfect. That's a perfect way to buckle down, get your weight under control, get your paperwork in, get your training on point, and possibly find yourself a big opportunity.